one of the main things that I want to say in this ongoing sort of YouTube internet discussion, right? And it'll be very weird to look back at these videos 40 years from now when I'm old and gray. But one of the main things that I want to say is that I am not in any sense suggesting, right, that I have the answers. In a very weird sense, getting feedback from the viewers, from you guys, from the audience, what is important in my lecture, what you didn't find as important in my lecture, what was helpful, what wasn't so helpful, is an attempt to recreate a dialogue that I would have were you to be in one of my classes. It can't be the case, right, if I am an educator, and I am an educator, it cannot be the case that I merely view myself in the following sense, right? If I am the oppressor, and specifically he talks about the role of the professor in this section, right? He talks specifically about the role of the professor, and his claim that I have some knowledge, and we'll abbreviate knowledge as K. And we have the role of the student, or the role of the oppressed, it doesn't matter, right? And there's a lack of knowledge, right? And this would be the oppressed. The traditional conception is that I've gone to school for all these years, I've amassed all of this knowledge, and what I do is I give this knowledge, or a portion of it, all right? I give this knowledge to the student so that the student ends up having the knowledge as well. So it's, first I have the knowledge, then I transmit this knowledge, then you have this knowledge. That's the assumption, right? So that knowledge and the transference of knowledge comes from, right? It's directed outward, right? Knowledge comes from. And this sounds like it's right. It sounds good. It sounds like the way that things ought to be. If it's the case that I have knowledge and I've amassed this knowledge, and I create a system in which I transfer this knowledge to another individual, and then you have knowledge, this number 2 becomes pedagogy. Right? Number 2 is pedagogy. It is the means in which I transfer this information, right? However, so that might be all well and good, but there's a huge problem with that, and this is not the type of educator that I am, because I've read Freire too many times to admit, right? What Freire says is the very assumption that I have something, and I transmit that information, it comes from me, empowers me, right? Because I become this locus of power. Jason Campbell, become this locus of power. We, as professionals, academics, as professors, as university instructors, become extremely elite, right? It's like you can believe that, oh, I've amassed all this knowledge and I am so much smarter than the general population, and I'll decide what information I want you to have, right? I won't give you as much information as I think can infringe on my personal development, right? So what I do is I'm very, very sparse with the information. You might get a little bit from me, but you're not going to get everything from me, right? That's one of the problems of information coming from. You, the recipient of this information, do not have a control, right? There is no mechanism in place to actually access all of the knowledge that the instructor really has. What is he not telling me? What is she not telling me? What could I know that they don't want me to know, right? There is in a sense, an inherent passivity of the oppressed, right? So that the oppressed becomes synonymous with that which is passive. And then obviously there becomes the assumption that there's an inherent activity. There becomes an inherent activity of the oppressor. I give to you, right? But that's really not what it's about. If we assume that that is true, right? If we assume, Freire says, that there is an inherent activity of the oppressor and a passivity of the oppressed, then I become active and you become lazy, right? Then I become knowledgeable and you become ignorant, and so on and so on and so on. So what we end up doing through this system of education is setting up a system of dependency, right? The way that we understand and the way that we transform this is by recognizing that there is at all times an exchange of information between the individual is said to know, me, the professor, and the community of population watching the students, whoever they may be. And at any time, I could be wrong, right? And I have said incorrect facts, and I have presented information incorrectly. And I do encourage my students to correct me, right? To challenge what it is that I'm saying, because I'm human like everybody else, and I am prone to error. That acceptance of my limitation creates the foundation in which we can exchange in true discourse, right? So for Freire, and this is very important because now we start to see how this is eventually going to transfer, and this is only chapter 1, right? How this is eventually going to transfer into a narrative of educational pedagogy proper, which, I mean, I can spend literally like 4 more hours just on this analysis, and I will later. It's important to recognize that this assumption, right, that information comes from the professor to the student is in itself inherently flawed. It, by definition, it essentially, foundationally, creates a dichotomous system, one of active participants, one of passive recipients, and this is the very thing that Freire is attempting to challenge, right? Next point, they, the oppressed, have been conditioned to distrust themselves, right? They've been conditioned to distrust themselves, right? If it's the case, right, that we are talking about the relationship between an oppressor and an oppressed group, the oppressed group, in and of themselves, right, the oppressed group, in and of themselves, lack trust, right? They don't trust each other, right? Why would I trust you, right? How could I trust you if you're the one that's oppressing me? So not only am I oppressed by the oppressor, right, the sub-oppressed, not only are they oppressed by the oppressor, they're oppressed by members of their own population. So this person is twofold oppressed, right? Twofold oppression. Right? So this person faces twofold oppression. I face oppression from the oppressor, like you, but unlike you, I also face oppression from members of my own community. So there's a twofold sense of oppression here. Well, obviously, I'm not going to trust, as this individual, either others who are oppressed, like me, but who are oppressing me, or those who are not like me and are oppressing me, right? I'm not going to trust members of my own population. And this condition of distrust among members of the oppressed population undermines the whole point of the struggle for liberation. In a previous, I think there was a last series of videos, we talked about the idea of the convert, right? And it was an oppressor who genuinely has an affinity for the oppressed group and wants to convert. And this is Freire's word, right? The oppressor, a former oppressor, who wants to relinquish his or her past, his or her privilege, his or her bias, in order to embrace a state of recognition, to be able to recognize what has systematically, through the process of structural and horizontal violence and all the other forms that we spoke about earlier, recognize the impoverishment of the oppressed group. But Freire says one of the main things that this oppressor must do is trust, right? Establish trust, camaraderie with members of the oppressed group. If I am, you can imagine now, just to make it sort of not so heady, imagine that I'm going into a village as a former oppressor. And in the village, there's bickering amongst members of the community. And this one's backstabbing this one, and this one's lying about that one, and everyone's telling lies and gossip about each other, and there's an obvious, apparent lack of trust. Well, obviously that lack of trust within the oppressed class is going to make me trust them even less. Me, as a potential convert, need to trust, right? I need to trust. But if I'm confronted with a lack of trust among members of the group, you can see how this is complicated, right? So what we need to do, right, and this is very important, it's not that apparent in Freire, right? This is sort of really getting deep now, is that what we need to do is, one, there needs to be an establishment of trust among members of the oppressed group, between oppressors and sub-oppressors. There has to be then followed by, so this establishment of trust needs to precede this establishment of trust, right? There needs to be an establishment of trust, a relationship of trust among members of oppressed populations. Once we've established that trust among members of populations, when potential converts are introduced to the population it'll be more likely that they too will trust, and thus facilitate the process of our mutual liberation.